The Unfinished War, a comprehensive history of Vietnam and its enduring legacy. Chapter 1, Roots of Conflict, Indochina and Colonial Ambitions. To understand the tumultuous war that gripped Vietnam for decades and eventually drew in the United States, one must look beyond the familiar narrative of American involvement and delve into centuries of Vietnamese history. This land, a slender S-shaped nation on Southeast Asia's eastern coast, possessed a spirit of fierce independence long before any Western power cast its shadow. For over 1,000 years, Vietnam battled Chinese domination, a struggle that forged its national identity and instilled a deep-seated resilience. This long fight against a powerful northern neighbor would prove to be a recurring theme in its history, leaving an indelible mark on its people and their willingness to fight for self-determination. By the mid-19th century, Vietnam was a collection of independent kingdoms, rich in rice paddies and cultural traditions. But it was also a land ripe for exploitation. European powers, fueled by the Industrial Revolution and imperial ambitions, sought new markets, resources, and strategic footholds. France, with its Catholic missionaries already establishing a presence, saw an opportunity. Citing the need to protect its clergy and expand its mercantile interests, Emperor Napoleon III dispatched naval forces. The city of Saigon fell in 1859, marking the beginning of a forceful conquest that would see France gradually subdue the entire region, integrating Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos into what became known as French Indochina. Life under French colonial rule was brutal for many Vietnamese. The French implemented a system of direct and indirect rule, dividing Vietnam into 3 administrative regions: Cochinchina, the south, a direct colony; Annam, the center, a protectorate with a nominal emperor; and Tonkin, the north, also a protectorate. This division not only facilitated control, but also sowed seeds of regionalism that would resonate for decades. Economically, Indochina was transformed into a vast resource base for France. Rubber plantations, notably those owned by the Michelin Company, mushroomed, often employing forced labor under horrific conditions. Coal mines, rice paddies, and extensive opium production fueled French coffers. The colonial administration established monopolies on salt, alcohol, and opium, extracting wealth from every corner of Vietnamese society, often at the expense of local well-being. Infrastructure, like railways and ports, was built, but its primary purpose was to transport raw materials for French industry, not to foster local development. Socially, the French maintained a rigid hierarchy, placing themselves at the apex, followed by a small, compliant Vietnamese elite, while the vast majority of the population endured poverty and political disenfranchisement. Education was limited, primarily serving to train a small cadre of obedient administrators, and French culture was superficially imposed. This period was marked by routine humiliation and harsh suppression of any dissent. Yet, simmering beneath the surface of French control was a tenacious spirit of resistance. Early nationalist movements emerged, often led by scholars or members of the old imperial court. Figures like Phan Boi Chau advocated for violent revolution, even seeking inspiration and aid from Japan, which had successfully modernized and resisted Western domination. Phan Chu Trinh, conversely, championed peaceful reform, emphasizing education and cultural renewal as paths to independence. These early struggles, though often crushed by the French, ensured that the flame of Vietnamese nationalism never truly extinguished. They laid the groundwork for a leader who would ultimately fuse these threads of resistance into a formidable force. That leader was Nguyen Sinh Khong, later known as Ho Chi Minh. Born in 1890 in a province renowned for its rebellious spirit, Ho Chi Minh's early life was steeped in anti-French sentiment. In 1911, he departed Vietnam as a kitchen hand on a French liner, embarking on a remarkable journey that would span 3 decades and take him across the globe through Europe, Africa, and even the United States. In Paris, following World War I, he famously presented a petition for Vietnamese self-determination to Woodrow Wilson at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. His plea, mirroring Wilson's own rhetoric of national self-determination, was ignored. This rejection by Western liberal democracies profoundly shaped Ho's worldview and pushed him towards another ideology, communism. He embraced the writings of Lenin, who argued that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism and that national liberation could only be achieved through revolutionary struggle. Ho Chi-minh spent years honing his revolutionary skills, attending Communist International meetings in Moscow and building networks among anti-colonial activists. In 1930, he unified various factions to form the Indochinese Communist Party, skillfully blending the principles of class struggle with the deep-seated desire for national liberation. When he finally returned to Vietnam in 1941, during the upheaval of World War II, he did so with a clear vision. Adopting the name Ho Chi-minh, meaning he who enlightens, he established the Viet Minh, short for the League for the Independence of Vietnam. This was not solely a communist front. It was a broad nationalist movement, strategically designed to attract anyone willing to fight for Vietnamese independence against both the Japanese occupiers and the collaborating French. Ho's unique genius lay in his ability to embody both nationalist hero and communist revolutionary, a combination that resonated deeply with the Vietnamese people. His ascetic lifestyle, intellectual prowess, and unwavering dedication to his country's freedom cemented his legendary status. World War II provided a critical window of opportunity. With France defeated by Nazi Germany, French colonial authority in Indochina weakened further, and Japanese forces moved in to occupy the territory. Paradoxically, this created a common enemy for the Viet Minh and, briefly, for the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA. The OSS provided limited aid and training to Ho's forces, who were seen as potential allies against the Japanese. Ho, ever pragmatic, accepted this tactical alliance, even quoting the American Declaration of Independence in his own declaration of Vietnamese independence on September 2, 1945, hoping for U.S. support. However, the geopolitical landscape shifted rapidly after the war. France, eager to reclaim its empire, returned with British and later American political and financial backing. Washington, increasingly concerned about the spread of communism in the emerging Cold War, prioritized supporting its European allies even if it meant backing French colonialism. This decision set the stage for the First Indochina War. From 1946 to 1954, French conventional forces battled the Viet Minh in a grueling conflict. The Viet Minh, led by the brilliant General Vo Nguyen Giap, masterfully employed guerrilla tactics, drawing the French into a frustrating and costly war of attrition. Giap understood that outright military victory against the technologically superior French was unlikely, but he could bleed them white, erode their will to fight, and gain popular support by being seen as the true liberator. The climax of this struggle came in 1954, in a remote valley nestled among the mountains of northwestern Vietnam, Dien Bien Phu. The French commander, General Henry Navarre, believed he could lure Giap's forces into a decisive set-piece battle, relying on French air power and artillery from their well-fortified base. What unfolded was an epic siege that defied expectations. General Giap, against all conventional military wisdom, secretly amassed a staggering force. Thousands of supply porters, using rudimentary bicycles and sheer human grit, hauled heavy artillery pieces and ammunition through dense jungle, scaling mountains to position them on hillsides overlooking the French garrison. They dug miles of tunnels and trenches, creating a network that allowed them to move troops and supplies without detection. Beginning on March 13, 1954, the Viet Minh launched their assault. The isolated French base, cut off from resupply by air after its airstrip was destroyed, endured a relentless bombardment and human wave attacks. Despite desperate bravery from the French and their colonial troops, and even covert consideration of American air intervention, which President Eisenhower ultimately rejected without British support, the outcome was inevitable. On May 7, 1954, Dien Bien Phu fell. It was a stunning and humiliating defeat for a major Western power, a symbol of the decline of colonialism at the hands of a determined, indigenous force. The echoes of Dien Bien Phu reverberated globally, inspiring anti-colonial movements, and sending a stark message to the West that superior firepower alone would not guarantee victory against a people fighting for their freedom. For Vietnam, it marked the end of French colonial rule, but it also ushered in a new, even more complex, chapter in its struggle for self-determination, one that would soon tragically involve another, far more powerful foreign adversary. Chapter 2. A dividing line from Dien Bien Phu to two Vietnams. The resounding defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu ignited a political firestorm that culminated in the Geneva Accords of 1954. Convened in neutral Switzerland, the conference brought together representatives from North and South Vietnam, France, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China. The primary aim was to achieve a comprehensive political settlement for Indochina, a tall order given the divergent interests at play. For Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV in the north, flushed with their victory, the goal was immediate reunification and complete independence. They had, after all, fought and won the war. For the French, it was about an honorable exit. For the United States, however, Geneva represented a critical juncture in the unfolding Cold War. The domino theory, articulated by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, posited that if one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably follow. Losing Vietnam, America feared, would trigger a cascade of communist victories across Southeast Asia. The compromise reached in Geneva was far from ideal for any party, and its ambiguities would sow the seeds of future conflict. Vietnam was to be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, creating the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, governed by the Viet Minh, and the state of Vietnam in the south, initially led by Emperor Bao Dai. Crucially, the accords stipulated that nationwide, free elections would be held in July 1956 to unify the country. This provisional division was intended to facilitate a ceasefire and troop withdrawals, not to create two permanent states. However, from the outset, the spirit of the Geneva Accords was undermined. The United States, while acknowledging the agreement, refused to sign it, instead issuing a separate declaration stating it would refrain from the threat or the use of force to disturb the accords, but emphasizing its support for self-determination. This was a critical distinction. Washington firmly believed that Ho Chi Minh, a communist and war hero, would overwhelmingly win any national election. Permitting such an outcome would be tantamount to allowing a communist takeover of the entire country, a direct contradiction of the domino theory. Therefore, the goal became to shore up a non-communist state in the South. In the South, the U.S. threw its weight behind Ngo Dinh Diem. A staunch anti-communist nationalist and devout Catholic, Diem had spent years in exile, including a period in the United States cultivating influential connections. He returned to Vietnam in 1954 to become Prime Minister of the state of Vietnam, pushing Emperor Bao Dai aside to establish the Republic of Vietnam in October 1955. Diem was seen by Washington as a strong leader who could stabilize the South and resist communist influence. He was, as then Senator John F. Kennedy put it, the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia. Billions of dollars in American aid, both economic and military, flowed into South Vietnam to support his fledgling government. Diem faced monumental challenges. His government was riddled with corruption, and his power base was narrow, relying heavily on loyalists from his Catholic minority and his own family. He was seen by many Buddhist-majority Vietnamese as an outsider, alienated by his authoritarian style and his favoritism towards Catholics. His land reform programs were ineffective, and he alienated the rural peasantry by replacing elected village officials with his own appointees. Most critically, he refused to hold the 1956 reunification elections, arguing that the North would manipulate the vote and that free elections were impossible in a communist state. This refusal, tacitly supported by the U.S., effectively sealed the division of Vietnam and ignited renewed armed struggle. While Diem consolidated power in the South, often ruthlessly suppressing political opposition, the North, under Ho Chi Minh, focused on rebuilding its war-torn infrastructure and implementing land reforms, sometimes brutally, to consolidate communist control. The North viewed the division as temporary, but Diem's refusal to hold elections, combined with increased U.S. backing, made it clear that reunification would not come peacefully. In the late 1950s, discontent in the South began to simmer and boil, especially in the rural areas and among veterans of the anti-French resistance who had been left behind after Geneva. The Diem regime's repressive policies, which included arbitrary arrests, torture, and the establishment of strategic hamlets, fortified villages designed to isolate the peasantry from communist influence, which often alienated villagers, created fertile ground for insurgency. Small, scattered groups of former Viet Minh, known as Viet Cong, a derogatory term meaning Vietnamese communists, began to coalesce. Supported by North Vietnam, which gradually increased its infiltration of arms and advisors along the nascent Ho Chi Minh Trail, these insurgents launched guerrilla attacks against Diem's government officials, military outposts, and infrastructure. In December 1960, the various southern rebel groups formally united to form the National Liberation Front, NLF. Though outside of Vietnam, it was widely referred to as the Viet Cong. While the NLF presented itself as a broad-based, non-communist coalition, its leadership and ultimate direction were firmly controlled by Hanoi. The early 1960s saw the U.S. commitment to South Vietnam deepen. Under President John F. Kennedy, the number of American military advisors grew from a few hundred to over 16,000. These advisors were ostensibly there to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, but they increasingly found themselves in combat situations. Kennedy, a strong proponent of counterinsurgency, believed that a limited application of U.S. military assistance could help Diem defeat the growing communist threat. Elite units like the Green Berets were deployed, tasked with training local forces and engaging in special operations. American helicopters transported ARVN troops, providing a crucial advantage in mobility. Yet, despite the influx of aid and advisors, the situation in South Vietnam deteriorated. Diem's government remained unpopular and ineffective. The strategic hamlet program proved largely counterproductive, alienating the very people it was intended to protect. In May 1963, a crisis erupted when Diem's forces fired on Buddhist demonstrators protesting the ban on displaying Buddhist flags, igniting widespread protests and self-immolations by Buddhist monks that shocked the world and drew condemnation from Washington. These dramatic acts of defiance highlighted the deep-seated religious and political discontent with Diem's rule. The growing instability in South Vietnam, combined with Diem's authoritarianism and his government's perceived inability to counter the NLF insurgency, led increasingly to American disillusionment with their chosen leader. Key figures within the Kennedy administration began to believe that Diem was more of a liability than an asset. Covert discussions took place between U.S. officials and a group of South Vietnamese generals plotting to overthrow Diem. The U.S. conveyed that it would not intervene to prevent such a coup. On November 1, 1963, Ngo Dinh Diem was overthrown and assassinated in a military coup, just 3 weeks before President Kennedy's own assassination. Diem's removal plunged South Vietnam into a period of acute political instability, marked by a succession of weak and ineffective governments. Instead of bringing clarity, his demise created a power vacuum that further undermined the South's ability to resist the North. The U.S. was now deeply entangled, having invested significant resources and credibility in a cause that seemed to be unraveling. The temporary line drawn at Geneva had hardened into a de facto border, and the conflict, once primarily a fight for independence from France, had transformed into a proxy war, with the United States increasingly committed to preventing the dominoes from falling. The stage was set for a massive escalation, as the modest advisory role of the early 1960s was about to transform into full-scale military intervention. Chapter 3. The expanding shadow Kennedy, Johnson, and the road to escalation. The assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in November 1963, just weeks before President John F. Kennedy's own tragic death, left a chaotic and deeply unstable South Vietnam in its wake. The U.S. had actively backed Diem for nearly a decade, pouring billions in aid and sending thousands of military advisors. His removal, though initially seen by some in Washington as necessary to salvage the anti-communist effort, instead sent South Vietnam spiraling into a period of acute political turbulence, marked by a succession of short-lived governments and military coups. This volatility at the helm of Saigon severely hampered any effective prosecution of the war against the Viet Cong insurgency. When Lyndon B. Johnson inherited the presidency, Vietnam was far from his primary focus. His ambitions lay firmly with domestic policy, particularly his ambitious Great Society programs aimed at alleviating poverty and racial injustice in America. However, the rapidly deteriorating situation in Southeast Asia demanded his attention. Johnson, a master of domestic politics, felt less confident on the international stage. He was keenly aware of the domestic political perils of being perceived as the president who lost Vietnam, especially after the loss of China to communism still loomed large in the memories of many American politicians. His advisors, many carried over from the Kennedy administration, largely agreed that American credibility on the world stage, particularly in the context of containing communism, was tied to upholding South Vietnam. Throughout 1964, the security situation in South Vietnam worsened. The Viet Cong, now well supplied by North Vietnam via the expanding Ho Chi Minh Trail and capitalizing on the political instability in the South, continued to gain ground in the countryside. They launched increasingly effective attacks, demonstrating their growing strength and resolve. Johnson faced mounting pressure from hawkish advisors and Congress to take more decisive action. The pivotal event that dramatically escalated U.S. involvement occurred in August 1964. On August 2nd, the U.S. destroyer USS Maddox, engaged in intelligence-gathering patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam, exchanged fire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The Maddox reported being attacked, and U.S. aircraft retaliated, damaging several North Vietnamese vessels. 2 days later, on August 4th, in stormy weather, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported being under torpedo attack again. While the first incident was later confirmed, the second alleged attack was highly contentious and remains historically disputed, with evidence now suggesting it likely never happened. However, in the immediate aftermath, U.S. officials accepted the reports as fact. President Johnson seized the moment to act decisively. He publicly condemned the unprovoked aggression and ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases and oil storage facilities. Crucially, he also sought and quickly obtained congressional authorization for broader action. On August 7, 1964, Congress overwhelmingly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution granted the president the authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. While not a formal declaration of war, it was widely interpreted as a blank check, effectively allowing the president to commit U.S. military forces to combat in Southeast Asia without further congressional approval. It was a momentous decision that fundamentally reshaped the nature of American involvement. Following the resolution, the U.S. began to ramp up its military posture, but a full combat presence was still several months away. A series of Viet Cong attacks on U.S. installations in late 1964 and early 1965, including mortar attacks on airfields at Bien Hoa and Pleiku that killed and wounded American personnel, provided the immediate triggers for a dramatic escalation. In February 1965, following an attack on the U.S. barracks at Pleiku, while National Security Advisor George Bundy was visiting, President Johnson authorized Operation Rolling Thunder. This was a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, initially conceived as an 8-week program of gradual escalation. Its objectives were varied: to shore up South Vietnamese morale, to deter North Vietnam from supporting the Viet Cong, and to destroy North Vietnam's industrial base and air defenses. Rolling Thunder would ultimately last for over 3 years, dropping more bombs than all the Allied forces dropped in the European theater during World War II combined. However, instead of deterring Hanoi, it intensified their resolve and pushed them further into the arms of their communist allies, China and the Soviet Union, who increased their aid. The bombing campaign immediately created a need for security. On March 8, 1965, the first U.S. combat troops, 2 battalions of Marines, landed on the beaches of Da Nang. Their initial mission was defensive, to protect the U.S. airbase from Viet Cong attacks. This seemingly small deployment marked a profound shift. For the first time, U.S. military personnel were in Vietnam not just as advisors or retaliators, but as ground combatants. Within weeks, the mission expanded. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, requested more troops, arguing that if U.S. forces were confined to static defense, they would be vulnerable to the enemy. He pressed for permission to use his troops offensively to seek out and destroy Viet Cong units. Johnson, increasingly convinced that more force was necessary to prevent a collapse in the South, approved Westmoreland's requests. By the end of 1965, nearly 200,000 American troops were in South Vietnam. The transition from advising to actively fighting was complete. The reasons for this rapid escalation were multifaceted. The domino theory fueled a deep-seated fear of communist expansion. American credibility, both to its allies and its adversaries, was perceived to be on the line. Johnson and his advisors believed that a limited application of force would quickly compel North Vietnam to negotiate a settlement favorable to the U.S. and its South Vietnamese allies. They underestimated the enemy's resolve, their willingness to absorb punishment, and their deep-seated desire for national reunification. What began as a limited intervention to protect air bases after alleged attacks had, in a matter of months, transformed into full-scale Americanization of the war, drawing the United States ever deeper into the quagmire of Vietnam. The future of the conflict would now be defined by American strategic decisions and the direct involvement of hundreds of thousands of its young soldiers. Chapter 4. The quagmire deepens: ground war, air power, and shifting strategies. By early 1966, the American flag was flying over more than just advisory compounds in South Vietnam. Almost 200,000 U.S. combat troops had arrived, and their numbers would steadily climb, peaking at over 500,000 men by 1968. The nature of the conflict had irrevocably shifted from a limited advisory role to a full-scale American war. The primary architect of this strategy was General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV. His strategic aim, approved by the Pentagon and the White House, was attrition warfare, to wage a war of superior firepower and mobility designed to inflict so many casualties on the enemy that they would lose the will and capability to fight. The key metric for success became the body count. This emphasis on attrition manifested in large-scale, search and destroy missions. American and ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, units would sweep through Viet Cong, VC, and North Vietnamese Army, NVA, controlled areas, often relying on massive air and artillery support to neutralize enemy forces. The theory was that by continuously grinding down the enemy, they would eventually reach a crossover point where their losses exceeded their ability to replace them, forcing them to negotiate. One of the earliest and most intense demonstrations of this strategy, and the brutal reality of the ground war, occurred in November 1965, just months after the first combat troops arrived. The Battle of Ia Drang Valley saw elements of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, engage large units of the NVA in ferocious close-quarters combat. Fought over several days, Ia Drang was a brutal, bloody fight, showcasing American air mobility, helicopter gunship support, and the destructive power of B-52 carpet bombing. While American casualties were significant, the NVA loss estimates were far higher, leading U.S. commanders to believe that attrition was indeed a viable path to victory. It reinforced Westmoreland's belief that by finding and killing enough of the enemy, the war could be won. Concurrently with the ground war, the aerial assault continued. Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, raged on. From 1965 to 1968, U.S. aircraft flew hundreds of thousands of sorties, dropping more bombs on North Vietnam than were dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. The targets included military bases, transportation routes, industrial facilities, and supply depots. The aim was to interdict the flow of men and supplies from north to south, to pressure Hanoi into negotiations, and to bolster morale in South Vietnam. However, North Vietnam's largely agrarian economy, dispersed targets, and extensive air defense networks, supplied by the Soviet Union and China, made the bombing campaign far less effective than anticipated. Furthermore, the relentless bombing only seemed to steel the resolve of the North Vietnamese, who demonstrated an incredible capacity for resilience and repair. The war in Vietnam, however, was not just about conventional military might. It was an asymmetrical conflict that confounded American assumptions. The Viet Cong and NVA were not fighting a conventional war. They were employing sophisticated guerrilla tactics inherited from their fight against the French. They blended into the civilian population, established elaborate tunnel networks, such as the sprawling Cu Cai tunnels near Saigon, for shelter and surprise attacks, utilized booby traps and ambushes, and maintained a highly flexible command structure. They fought on their home turf, knew the terrain intimately, and enjoyed a certain degree of popular support, or, at minimum, popular tolerance, especially in the rural areas. This made it extraordinarily difficult for American troops to distinguish friend from foe, leading to immense frustration and, at times, indiscriminate violence. Recognizing that military force alone would not secure victory, the U.S. and South Vietnamese governments also pursued pacification efforts, often referred to as winning the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese populace. Programs like the Civic Action and Revolutionary Development aimed to provide security, deliver social services, build infrastructure, and foster local governance, thereby separating the villagers from Viet Cong influence. However, these efforts often struggled. Conflicting priorities between military operations and pacification frequently occurred. A search and destroy mission might destroy a village whose residents had just been pacified. Corruption within the South Vietnamese government, the inherent difficulty of building effective local institutions during wartime, and the enduring mistrust of foreign occupiers undermined many well-intentioned initiatives. The years 1966 and 1967 saw American troop levels swell and the scale of the fighting intensify. Major operations like Operation Attleboro, Operation Cedar Falls, and Operation Junction City deployed thousands of troops, utilizing sophisticated tactics and massive firepower. Yet, despite repeated claims of high enemy casualties and the light at the end of the tunnel, narrative promoted by the political and military leadership, the war seemed to grind on without a clear path to victory. The Viet Cong and NVA continued to launch attacks, demonstrating their ability to absorb losses and reconstitute their forces. The attrition strategy, while inflicting heavy tolls on the enemy, also bled American forces and had little discernible effect on Hanoi's strategic resolve. For the American soldier, these years were characterized by constant vigilance, the oppressive heat and humidity of the jungle, and the psychological toll of a war without front lines. The enemy was elusive, the mission often unclear beyond killing the enemy, and the progress measured in body counts rather than territory gained or institutions built. The quagmire was deepening, not just militarily, but also politically and morally, setting the stage for a dramatic turning point that would shatter American perceptions of the war. Chapter 5, The Year of Shocks, 1968, Tet, Turmoil, and a Nation Divided. As the calendar turned to 1968, the official narrative emanating from Washington, D.C. and Saigon painted a cautiously optimistic picture of the Vietnam War. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces, spoke publicly of the enemy's declining strength and the light at the end of the tunnel. Progress, it seemed, was being made through the strategy of attrition and relentless search and destroy missions. The Viet Cong, VC, and North Vietnamese Army NVA were supposedly on the verge of defeat, their capacity to mount major offensives severely degraded. American public opinion, while increasingly restive, still harbored hope that the war was winnable, if painful. This veneer of optimism was shattered in the most brutal and unexpected way on January 30, 1968, beginning on the first day of the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, known as Tet. What followed was a series of coordinated, surprise attacks across South Vietnam that became known as the Tet Offensive. North Vietnam's leaders, having observed the erosion of American morale and the growing dissent at home, knew they could not win a conventional war against U.S. firepower. Their strategy was audacious: to launch a massive, simultaneous offensive designed to spark a general uprising among the South Vietnamese populace, demonstrate the Saigon government's weakness, and prove to the American public that victory was unattainable. Exploiting a traditional Tet ceasefire, over 80,000 NVA and VC troops burst from their hidden positions, striking virtually every major city, town, and military installation in South Vietnam. The sheer scale and coordination of the attacks caught the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces completely by surprise. Among the targets were provincial capitals, airfields, governmental buildings, and even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. In Saigon, a VC sapper unit blasted its way into the embassy compound, an act that sent shockwaves across the world as images of American soldiers fighting within the embassy grounds were broadcast. While the embassy itself was quickly secured, the psychological impact was devastating. If the enemy could penetrate the very heart of American authority in South Vietnam, where was truly safe. The fighting was intense and widespread, often house to house, revealing the Viet Cong's deep infiltration of urban areas previously thought secure. The battles raged for weeks in some locations, most notably in the ancient imperial city of Hue. For 26 days, U.S. Marines and ARVN forces fought bitterly to retake the city, street by bloody street, often against determined NVA regulars. The battle for Hue was one of the longest and bloodiest of the war, resulting in vast destruction to the historic city and tragic civilian casualties. After the recapture of Hue, evidence of a horrific massacre emerged. NVA and VC forces had systematically executed thousands of local officials, intellectuals, and their families, seen as collaborators with the South Vietnamese government. From a purely military perspective, the Tet Offensive was a catastrophic defeat for the NVA and Viet Cong. They suffered immense casualties, estimated at over 45,000 killed, shattering the VCS fighting capacity in the South for years to come. The hoped-for general uprising never materialized, and the South Vietnamese people, largely exhausted by years of war, did not rally to the communist cause. U.S. and ARVN forces, though initially caught off guard, reacted swiftly and effectively, inflicting heavy losses on the attackers. However, the true victory of Tet for Hanoi was not military, but political and psychological. The images and reports flashed across American television screens directly contradicted the optimistic pronouncements from the White House and the Pentagon. If the enemy was supposedly on their last legs, how could they have mounted such a massive, coordinated attack? The credibility gap, the growing chasm between official statements and the reality presented by the media, widened into an unbridgeable chasm. Perhaps no single moment captured this public disillusionment more powerfully than CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite's visit to Vietnam shortly after the offensive. Cronkite, widely considered the most trusted man in America, filed a special report concluding, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past." This powerful declaration, coming from such a respected figure, profoundly affected public opinion and reportedly had a direct impact on President Johnson. Upon hearing Cronkite's report, Johnson famously told his press secretary, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The aftermath of Tet plunged American politics into turmoil. Anti-war sentiment surged, reaching unprecedented levels. Opinion polls showed a dramatic drop in public support for Johnson's handling of the war. Within weeks of the offensive, Senator Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war Democrat, ran a surprisingly strong campaign against Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. Shortly after, Robert F. Kennedy, sensing the shift in public mood, also announced his candidacy for president, further challenging the incumbent. Stunned by these developments and facing deeply divided nation, President Johnson announced on March 31, 1968, that he would not seek re-election. In the same speech, he ordered a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and called for peace talks. The war, it seemed, had broken him. 1968 continued to be a year of shocks. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. in April and Robert F. Kennedy in June plunged the nation into even deeper despair and unrest. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August devolved into violent clashes between protesters and police, broadcast live to a horrified nation. Richard Nixon, promising peace with honor and representing a silent majority tired of the unrest, would capitalize on this national exhaustion and division to win the presidency in November. The Tet Offensive, though a military defeat for the Communists, irrevocably altered the course of the Vietnam War. It demonstrated that Hanoi possessed the will and capability to continue fighting indefinitely, shattering any remaining illusions of a quick American victory. It profoundly eroded American public support for the war, leading to a shift in U.S. policy from outright victory to seeking a negotiated withdrawal. The year 1968 thus stands as the pivotal turning point, the moment when the quagmire in Vietnam truly became America's longest war, and the nation at home found itself deeply and painfully divided. Chapter 6: A War on Two Fronts. Life in Vietnam and Dissent at Home. While the war raged in Vietnam, a different kind of battle unfolded simultaneously on the American home front. For those serving in country, the Vietnam War was a sensory overload of heat, humidity, and the ever-present threat of an unseen enemy. For those back home, it became a deeply polarizing force, tearing apart the fabric of American society. Life for the American soldier in Vietnam was far removed from the romanticized notions of previous wars. There were no grand front lines, no decisive battles for territory. Instead, the war was a series of small, brutal engagements, sudden ambushes, and constant vigilance against booby traps laid by the Viet Cong. The enemy was often indistinguishable from the civilian population, making trust a hazardous commodity. Soldiers quickly learned that danger could come from anywhere: a tripwire in tall grass, a hidden tunnel system, or a sudden burst of AK-47 fire from a seemingly peaceful rice paddy. The environment itself was an adversary. Sweltering, oppressive heat and humidity gave way to monsoon rains and thick, energy-sapping mud. Disease, from malaria to dysentery, was rampant. The mental toll was immense. American forces operated on one-year tour of duty, a policy intended to boost morale, but which often meant that soldiers were motivated more by ticking down the days to their return than by achieving strategic objectives. This rotation system also meant a lack of continuity in units, with constantly changing personnel making it difficult to build cohesive bonds and experienced leadership. Morale often fluctuated, influenced by the news from home, the perceived effectiveness of their missions, and the quality of their leadership. Short breaks, or R&R, rest and recuperation, offered brief respite in places like Bangkok or Hawaii, but the return to the war zone was always a jarring reality. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the anti-war movement was growing from a niche concern of college intellectuals into a powerful national force. Its roots lay in the civil rights movement, which had taught activists the efficacy of nonviolent protest and civil disobedience. Early opposition to the war often focused on moral objections to the conflict itself, questioning the ethics of American intervention in a distant Asian land and the immense human cost. As the war escalated and the draft began taking more young men, pragmatic concerns about American lives and resources also fueled dissent. The draft became a major flashpoint. Mandatory conscription disproportionately affected young men from lower economic backgrounds and minority communities, who were less likely to receive college deferments. This fueled charges that the war was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Young men burned draft cards, dodged the draft by fleeing to Canada, or sought conscientious objector status, often at great personal cost. The movement gained momentum through mass demonstrations. From the early protests by Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, in 1965, to the massive march on the Pentagon in October 1967, and the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam in 1969, thousands, then hundreds of thousands, took to the streets. These protests often brought together a diverse coalition: students, academics, religious leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who eloquently linked the war to domestic poverty and racial inequality, counterculture figures, and increasingly disillusioned veterans. The media played an unprecedented role in shaping public perception. Vietnam was the first television war. Nightly news broadcasts brought the brutal realities of combat directly into American living rooms, often unfiltered and graphic. Images of burning villages, wounded soldiers, and civilian casualties sharply contrasted with official optimism, fueling the credibility gap between what the government said and what the public saw. Walter Cronkite's influential pronouncement of a stalemate after the Tet Offensive symbolized the media's shift from largely supporting the war effort to increasingly questioning its rationale and conduct. This visual immediacy and critical reporting fostered a more informed, yet more conflicted, public. The anti-war movement intersected powerfully with other social upheavals of the time. The counterculture movement, largely composed of young people, challenged traditional American values and norms, embracing peace, love, and anti-establishment sentiments. The war became a focal point for their critique of authority and societal structures. The civil rights movement, under the leadership of figures like Martin Luther King Jr., began to openly oppose the war, arguing that it diverted vital resources from domestic programs, disproportionately affected African American soldiers who were fighting for liberties abroad they did not possess at home, and was morally indefensible. The brutal experiences of Black soldiers in Vietnam, often fighting alongside white soldiers in a country where racial segregation and discrimination persisted, further highlighted the hypocrisy. This war on two fronts, the brutal struggle in Southeast Asia and the escalating social conflict at home, was tearing the nation apart. The divisions were not simply political, they were generational, racial, and moral. The returning veteran, often spat upon or ignored, became a symbol of the nation's profound ambivalence about the conflict. As the war dragged on, these internal divisions would only deepen, dramatically influencing the political landscape and the eventual withdrawal of American forces. The year 1968 had shattered illusions of victory. Now, the nation grappled with the profound costs, both human and societal, of a protracted conflict. Chapter 7. Nixon's War Vietnamization, Cambodia, and the Silent Majority. Richard Nixon ascended to the presidency in January 1969, promising peace with honor in Vietnam. He inherited a deeply divided nation and a war that had shattered public confidence in its leaders. Nixon's strategy was built on complex, often contradictory, objectives: to end American involvement in the war without appearing to surrender, to maintain U.S. credibility, and to bring home the troops while preserving an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. His primary policy to achieve these goals was Vietnamization. This strategy aimed to gradually withdraw U.S. combat troops while simultaneously building up, equipping, and training the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, to take over the burden of fighting. The idea was to shift the responsibility for the ground war back to the South Vietnamese, thereby reducing American casualties and appeasing the anti-war movement at home, while still maintaining military pressure on North Vietnam through air power and diplomacy. The first troop withdrawals began in mid-1969, a clear signal that the U.S. was indeed disengaging its ground forces. However, as Nixon was pulling troops out, he pursued a controversial expansion of the air war and covert ground operations. Recognizing that the North Vietnamese supply lines, primarily the Ho Chi Minh Trail, snaked through neutral Cambodia and Laos, Nixon authorized secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia beginning in March 1969. News of these secret wars was meticulously kept from the American public and Congress for over a year, leading to charges of executive overreach and deceit. The logic was that these operations would buy time for Vietnamization by disrupting enemy supply lines and destroying their sanctuaries. The secret bombings became public and sparked outrage when, on April 30, 1970, Nixon announced a U.S. and ARVN incursion into Cambodia. This cross-border operation, involving thousands of American and South Vietnamese troops, was ostensibly to destroy NVA and Viet Cong command centers and supply depots. While military officials claimed some tactical success in capturing enemy materiel, the incursion ignited a firestorm of protest across the United States. Many viewed it as an unacceptable expansion of a war the president had promised to end. The most tragic outcome of the Cambodia incursion for American citizens occurred on May 4, 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio. During an anti-war protest on campus, National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed students, killing 4 and wounding 9. 10 days later, at Jackson State College in Mississippi, 2 students were killed and 12 wounded under similar circumstances. These shootings sent shockwaves across the nation, dramatically escalating the intensity of the anti-war movement and deepening the divisions within American society. For many, the incident symbolized the government's willingness to use violence against its own citizens, highlighting the immense domestic cost of the war. Despite the protests, Nixon believed he had the support of the silent majority, the portion of the American public who were not actively protesting, but who generally supported the war effort or at least wanted to see a resolute end to it. He publicly appealed to this group, contrasting their patriotism with the perceived radicalism and unruliness of the anti-war movement. The paradox of Vietnamization was that as U.S. troops withdrew, American air power escalated dramatically. Operations such as Operation Linebacker I and II, 1972, saw hundreds of B-52 bombers unleash unprecedented devastation on North Vietnam, including heavily populated areas. As Nixon sought to force Hanoi back to the negotiating table and support the struggling ARVN during the North's Easter offensive. Beyond the strategic maneuvers, the Nixon era also witnessed a growing crisis of discipline and morale within the U.S. military itself. Drug use, racial tensions, and disillusioned soldiers became increasingly common. The Vietnam War's brutal realities, coupled with the growing anti-war sentiment at home, eroded troop cohesion. One of the darkest chapters revealed during this period was the My Lai massacre. In March 1968, American soldiers from Charlie Company had massacred hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, women, children, and old men in the hamlet of My Lai. The story, initially suppressed, broke in late 1969 and led to a court-martial for Lieutenant William Calley. My Lai exposed the moral corrosiveness of the war and deeply wounded America's self-image, further fueling the anti-war movement and strengthening doubts about the war's ethical basis. By 1971, with troop withdrawals steadily proceeding, but the war seemingly no closer to a conclusive end, the American public was weary. The publication of the Pentagon Papers in the New York Times in June 1971 further fueled cynicism. This classified Department of Defense study revealed that successive U.S. administrations had systematically misled the public about the true extent of American involvement and objectives in Vietnam. The disclosures confirmed many of the anti-war movement's suspicions and further eroded trust in government. Nixon's complex strategy of withdrawal and escalation was a precarious balancing act. He was determined to avoid the perception of defeat, even as he systematically reduced the American military footprint. The goal was to leave a strong enough South Vietnam that it could defend itself, thereby achieving peace with honor. But the cost of this prolonged disengagement, measured in lives, resources, and intensifying domestic turmoil, continued to mount, laying the groundwork for the ultimate and inevitable end of direct U.S. military involvement. Chapter 8: The Negotiated Retreat Paris Accords, POWs, and the Fragile Peace. As 1972 dawned, the Vietnam War had become a torturous, seemingly endless conflict for the United States. President Nixon, while committed to Vietnamization and the withdrawal of American ground troops, was simultaneously determined to achieve a settlement that preserved America's credibility and the independence of South Vietnam. Secret peace talks had been ongoing in Paris since 1968, but progress was agonizingly slow, often characterized by deadlock and intransigence from all sides. North Vietnam demanded a complete, unconditional U.S. withdrawal and the removal of the Saigon regime, while the U.S. insisted on a reciprocal withdrawal by North Vietnamese troops from the south and the survival of the Thieu government. The year 1972, however, proved to be a pivotal one both militarily and diplomatically. In March, North Vietnam launched its largest offensive since Tet 1968, known as the Easter Offensive or Nguyen Hue Offensive. It was a massive, three-pronged conventional invasion across the demilitarized zone, and from Laos and Cambodia, involving tanks and heavy artillery, aimed at seizing key cities and provinces in South Vietnam. The offensive was a direct test of Vietnamization, designed to demonstrate that the ARVN could not stand on its own without substantial U.S. ground support. While the offensive initially inflicted heavy losses on the ARVN, Nixon responded with a ferocious application of American air power. He ordered Operation Linebacker I, a sustained bombing campaign against military targets and transportation infrastructure in North Vietnam, including targets previously off-limits. Most significantly, he authorized the mining of North Vietnamese harbors, including Haiphong, a bold and risky move designed to cut off supplies from the Soviet Union and China. The concentrated air support, including B-52 strikes, proved crucial in stemming the North Vietnamese advance and allowing the ARVN to eventually push back. The Easter Offensive, though costly for both sides, ultimately ended as a strategic defeat for North Vietnam, proving that the ARVN, with significant American air support, could hold its ground. The strategic deadlock, combined with the increasing desire of all parties to end the war, created an opening for genuine progress in the Paris peace talks. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's national security advisor, had been conducting secret, high-level negotiations with North Vietnamese Politburo member Le Duc Tho for years. By October 1972, a breakthrough seemed imminent. Kissinger famously declared that peace is at hand just before the U.S. presidential election. However, the agreement quickly unraveled. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, fearing that the proposed accord would leave his country vulnerable to a future North Vietnamese offensive by allowing North Vietnamese troops to remain in the South, rejected the draft agreement. With peace talks stalled and the agreement on the brink of collapse, Nixon resorted to a controversial, coercive measure. In December 1972, he unleashed Operation Linebacker II, often called the Christmas bombing. For 11 days and nights, American B-52 bombers and fighter bombers struck targets in and around Hanoi and Haiphong in the most intense bombing campaign of the entire war. The objective was to force Hanoi back to the negotiating table and to reassure South Vietnam that the U.S. would not abandon them entirely. The bombing was met with widespread international condemnation and furious domestic protest, but it had its intended effect. North Vietnam returned to the negotiating table. On January 27, 1973, after months of painstaking negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed. The agreement contained several key provisions: a ceasefire in place. This meant that both sides would hold the territory they occupied at the time of the signing. Crucially, it left over 150,000 North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. Withdrawal of all remaining U.S. combat forces. All American troops were to leave Vietnam within 60 days. Return of all prisoners of war, POWs. This was a major point of emphasis for the U.S. Formation of a National Council of National Reconciliation and Concord. This body, composed of representatives from the Saigon government, the Viet Cong, and neutralists, was intended to oversee political reconciliation and plan for elections in South Vietnam. Recognition of the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, as a provisional dividing line, not a political or territorial boundary. For the Americans, the most tangible and emotional outcome of the accords was the return of their prisoners of war. Operation Homecoming saw 591 American POWs repatriated, many having endured years of brutal captivity and torture in North Vietnamese prisons like the infamous Hanoi Hilton. Their stoic dignity and tales of resilience captivated the nation, offering a rare moment of unity and pride in an otherwise divisive conflict. With the return of the POWs and the last U.S. combat troops leaving by March 29, 1973, President Nixon declared, "We have achieved peace with honor." However, the peace was fragile at best. The Paris Accords, while ending direct American military involvement, did not bring true peace to Vietnam. The fundamental political differences remained unresolved. The National Council never materialized, and the ceasefire was routinely violated by both sides. The accords essentially established a framework for a continued, albeit lower intensity, conflict between North and South Vietnam. The U.S. continued to provide substantial military and economic aid to South Vietnam. But without the ultimate guarantee of American ground forces, the strategic balance had fundamentally shifted. For North Vietnam, the withdrawal of U.S. troops was their ultimate objective. They correctly perceived that without American ground power, an eventual victory would be within their grasp. The stage was set for the final, tragic chapter of the Vietnam War, one that would see the collapse of the South and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule, far sooner than many in Washington had anticipated. Chapter 9, The Final Collapse, the Fall of Saigon, and the End of an Era. The peace, achieved by the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973, proved to be nothing more than a momentary lull in the storm. The ink was barely dry on the agreement before both sides began violating its terms. The ceasefire was nominal. Fighting continued, albeit at a lower intensity than during the peak American involvement. North Vietnam continued to infiltrate troops and supplies into the South, expanding and upgrading the Ho Chi Minh Trail. South Vietnam, on the other hand, sought to regain territory lost and eliminate communist infrastructure. The critical difference was that without the physical presence of American ground troops and the certainty of immediate, massive U.S. air intervention, the strategic balance began to shift inexorably in Hanoi's favor. South Vietnam was left largely to its own devices, dependent on continued U.S. financial and military aid. However, the American political landscape had fundamentally changed. The Watergate scandal consumed President Nixon's attention, and his eventual resignation in August 1974 severely weakened the presidency. Congress, increasingly assertive and reflecting deep public weariness with Vietnam, dramatically cut aid to South Vietnam. What had been billions of dollars in military assistance quickly dwindled to hundreds of millions, crippling the ARVN's ability to maintain its equipment, pay its troops, and execute effective operations. Fuel prices soared due to the 1973 oil crisis, further straining South Vietnam's already precarious economy. Hanoi, observing these developments, the decline in U.S. aid, the political turmoil in Washington, and the evident lack of American will to re-engage militarily, sensed its moment. In December 1974, North Vietnam launched a probing attack on Phuoc Long Province, a relatively minor target. The ARVN put up a valiant fight, but ultimately collapsed. Crucially, the United States, despite earlier promises of support, did nothing. No airstrikes, no protests, no significant American reaction. This was the acid test. Hanoi concluded that the U.S. would not intervene, even if South Vietnam faced existential threat. Emboldened by this non-response, North Vietnam's Politburo approved a full-scale offensive to unify the country by 1976. General Van Tine Dung, the architect of the new campaign, launched the final offensive in March 1975, targeting the Central Highlands. The initial assault on Ban Mi Thuot was swift and decisive. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu made the disastrous decision to withdraw the ARVN from the highlands in a chaotic, ill-planned retreat that quickly turned into a rout. Morale plummeted, and units disintegrated. The collapse was far faster than even North Vietnam had anticipated. City after city fell, often with minimal resistance, as ARVN units abandoned their posts and civilians fled in panic. Da Nang, the second-largest city in South Vietnam and a former major U.S. base, descended into anarchy as terrified soldiers and civilians fought for spaces on departing ships and planes. The images of chaos, reminiscent of a dying regime, played out on televisions worldwide. The North Vietnamese juggernaut rolled south, seemingly unstoppable. As the NVA closed in on Saigon, the sense of impending doom was palpable. American diplomatic personnel and military attachés desperately tried to evacuate remaining U.S. citizens and South Vietnamese allies who feared retribution under communist rule. On April 29, 1975, with North Vietnamese tanks on the outskirts of the capital and rockets falling on Tan Son Nha Air Base, the final, desperate evacuation began. Operation Frequent Wind was the largest helicopter evacuation in history. From the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, Marine helicopters lifted off, carrying Ambassador Graham Martin, U.S. personnel, and clinging South Vietnamese evacuees. The iconic image of a Huey helicopter perched precariously on the embassy roof, with a line of desperate people scrambling up a ladder, symbolized the ignominious end of America's longest war. Thousands of South Vietnamese, many of whom had worked with or fought alongside Americans, were left behind, their lives now uncertain under the approaching communist regime. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The remaining South Vietnamese officials surrendered unconditionally. The flag of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, the political arm of the Viet Cong, was raised, marking the formal end of the Republic of Vietnam. Saigon was swiftly renamed Ho Chi Minh City, solidifying the communist victory and the reunification of Vietnam under a single, socialist government. The fall of Saigon was a watershed moment. For the United States, it represented the first military defeat in its history and the final, bitter conclusion to a war that had spanned more than a decade, cost over 58,000 American lives, and billions of dollars. It left a profound scar on the American psyche, eroding public trust in government and fostering a deep reluctance to engage in large-scale foreign interventions, a phenomenon later dubbed the Vietnam Syndrome. For the Vietnamese, the war, ultimately dubbed the American War, concluded with their long-sought national reunification, but at an immense cost. Millions of Vietnamese, both military and civilian from both North and South, had perished. The land was scarred by bombs, defoliants like Agent Orange, and the remnants of decades of conflict. The end of the war did not bring immediate peace and prosperity for all. Instead, it ushered in a new era of challenges, including political re-education camps, economic hardship, and a mass exodus of refugees known as the Boat People, who would seek new lives in countries around the world. The war was over, but its echoes would linger for generations. Chapter 10. Aftermath and Echoes, Returning Veterans, Healing Wounds, and Rebuilding Lives. With the fall of Saigon, the cameras turned away from Vietnam. But the war's aftermath left deep, enduring scars on both sides of the Pacific. For the United States, the immediate concern was the reintegration of its returning veterans, a task that proved far more complex and painful than anticipated. For Vietnam, reunification brought its own set of challenges, from economic recovery to political consolidation and a massive humanitarian crisis. The return home, American veterans, unlike veterans of previous wars, who often returned to parades and national gratitude, many Vietnam veterans came home to a country bitterly divided by the conflict. There were no victory parades. Instead, they often faced indifference, hostility, or outright blame for a war that had become deeply unpopular. Many suppressed their experiences, finding it difficult to talk to a public that seemed to misunderstand or resent their service. This lack of public acknowledgement compounded the private struggles faced by many. One of the most insidious and pervasive legacies was post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. While the condition had existed in various forms throughout history, known as shell shock or combat fatigue, Vietnam was the first war where PTSD became widely recognized and studied. Many veterans grappled with intrusive memories, flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness. The unique nature of the guerrilla war, the lack of clear battle lines, the moral ambiguities, and the early exposure to heavy combat for young, often unwilling, soldiers contributed significantly to the psychological toll. The VA health system, ill-equipped to handle the unprecedented scale of these mental health challenges, struggled to provide adequate care, leaving many veterans to cope in isolation. Another profound issue was exposure to Agent Orange. Between 1961 and 1971, the U.S. military sprayed millions of gallons of herbicides, including Agent Orange, over vast areas of Vietnam to strip away jungle foliage and deny cover to the enemy, and to destroy food crops. Decades later, veterans began to report a range of serious health problems, including various cancers, neurological disorders, and birth defects in their children, linking them to their exposure to the toxic defoliant. The fight for recognition, medical care, and compensation for Agent Orange-related illnesses became a prolonged legal and political battle for affected veterans and their families. Despite the initial rocky reception, a slow but steady societal shift began. The dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. in 1982 marked a turning point. Its stark, black granite walls etched with the names of over 58,000 fallen Americans offered a powerful, non-political space for healing and remembrance. Its design encouraged personal reflection, allowing veterans and their loved ones to connect with the names, providing a necessary, if belated, form of national reconciliation and acknowledgement of their sacrifice. Support groups emerged, and veterans began to speak out, sharing their stories and experiences, leading to a greater understanding of the war's human cost and the struggles of those who fought it. This introspection gradually led to a more nuanced perception of the Vietnam veteran, recognizing their service and distinguishing between the soldiers and the politics of the war itself. Vietnam. Rebuilding and reconciliation. For Vietnam, the end of the war brought reunification, but also immense challenges. The country was devastated, its infrastructure shattered, its agricultural lands poisoned, and its population traumatized. The communist government, initially victorious, faced the Herculean task of rebuilding and governing a unified nation. Grappling with ideological differences between the more conservative North and the more capitalist-oriented South. Initially, efforts at rapid collectivization and re-education in the South led to widespread economic hardship and severe social dislocation. Hundreds of thousands of former South Vietnamese officials, soldiers, and intellectuals were sent to re-education camps, some for years, where they endured forced labor and political indoctrination. Many Vietnamese who had allied with the U.S. or simply opposed the communist regime faced discrimination and repression. This repression, combined with dire economic conditions, led to a mass exodus of refugees. These were the boat people, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who fled by sea, often in dangerously overcrowded and unseaworthy vessels, facing piracy, starvation, and drowning. Neighboring countries struggled to cope with the influx, and many eventually resettled in Western nations, including the United States, forming vibrant Vietnamese diaspora communities. Despite the animosity of the war, Vietnam slowly began a path towards reconciliation, both internally and with its former adversaries. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Vietnam began to implement Doi Moi renovation reforms, shifting towards a market-oriented economy while maintaining communist political control. This economic opening gradually brought Vietnam into the global economy. Relations with the U.S. remained frozen for many years, primarily due to the unresolved issue of missing in action, MIA personnel, and a U.S. economic embargo. However, persistent efforts by both sides, including cooperation on MIA recovery, gradually led to a thaw. The U.S. embargo was lifted in 1994, and full diplomatic relations were restored in 1995. This laid the foundation for burgeoning trade, cultural exchange, and even military cooperation in the 21st century, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for healing and moving forward despite the immense historical pain. The aftermath of the Vietnam War was a testament to the resilience of human spirit, both for those who fought and for the nations scarred by conflict. It highlighted the long tail of global trauma, the complex challenges of reintegration, and the slow, arduous process of both physical and psychological reconstruction. The echoes of that era continue to ripple through society, shaping memories, policies, and the very understanding of conflict itself. Chapter 11. The broader canvas, Vietnam's influence on Cold War policies and global affairs. The Vietnam War was not merely a localized conflict. It was a deeply embedded piece of the larger Cold War chessboard, profoundly shaping global politics, military doctrines, and the international balance of power for decades. Its impact stretched far beyond the Mekong Delta and the rice paddies, influencing superpower relations, proxy wars, and the very concept of military intervention. Foremost among these influences was the collapse of the domino theory. The central tenet of successive U.S. administrations, from Eisenhower to Johnson, was that if Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeast Asian nations would swiftly follow suit. This fear underpinned the massive American intervention. Yet, after Saigon fell in 1975, the dominoes did not fall as predicted. While Laos and Cambodia did indeed come under communist rule, with Cambodia suffering the horrific Khmer Rouge genocide, the cascade across the rest of Southeast Asia never materialized. Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia remained firmly non-communist, economically vibrant, and largely aligned with the West. This historical reality forced a fundamental reevaluation of the efficacy of the domino theory as a guiding principle of foreign policy, casting doubt on interventionist strategies based on similar geopolitical assumptions. The war also dramatically altered U.S. foreign policy itself. The defeat in Vietnam fostered a deep public and political aversion to large-scale military interventions, a phenomenon popularly dubbed the Vietnam Syndrome. For nearly 2 decades after 1975, the specter of Vietnam loomed large, making presidents and policymakers extremely cautious about committing American troops abroad, particularly to prolonged, costly ground wars in distant lands. This caution manifested in various ways: a greater emphasis on diplomacy, reliance on proxy forces, and the development of rapid deployment forces for limited, decisive engagements. Only with the Persian Gulf War in 1990, did President George H.W. Bush declare, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam Syndrome once and for all," signaling a cautious return to more assertive foreign policy. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Vietnam War had a complex impact on the Cold War superpowers, the Soviet Union and China. Both communist giants provided substantial aid to North Vietnam, seeing the conflict as an opportunity to bleed their capitalist rival, the United States, without direct confrontation. However, the war also exacerbated existing tensions between Moscow and Beijing, each vying for influence over Hanoi and the global communist movement. The fierce Sino-Soviet ideological split meant that their aid came with strings and often forced Hanoi to skillfully navigate a complex geopolitical tightrope. The war arguably deepened the Sino-American rapprochement, as Nixon and Kissinger pursued détente with China in part to isolate North Vietnam and to create a strategic counterweight to the Soviet Union. The conflict also spurred significant changes in military doctrine and technology. The U.S. military, forced to confront the realities of asymmetric warfare, began to adapt. Lessons were learned, often painfully, about counterinsurgency, the importance of winning hearts and minds, and the limitations of conventional firepower against a determined guerrilla foe. The war hastened the development of precision-guided munitions and satellite reconnaissance. The concept of total war was re-examined. The public's tolerance for prolonged conflict and high casualties diminished, pushing military strategists to consider more limited, technologically advanced warfare. The all-volunteer force, instituted after the draft ended, was a direct consequence of the Vietnam War, seeking to professionalize the military and separate it from the societal divisions caused by conscription. Furthermore, Vietnam served as a stark example of a proxy war, a common feature of the Cold War where superpowers backed opposing sides without directly engaging each other. It highlighted the dangers and complexities of such conflicts, often drawing in regional actors and exacerbating local grievances. This model of indirect conflict played out in various forms across Africa, Latin America, and Afghanistan in subsequent decades, often with devastating humanitarian consequences. Globally, the Vietnam War provided a powerful source of inspiration for nascent anti-colonial and liberation movements. Ho Chi Minh's successful fusion of nationalism and communism, and the determined resistance of the Vietnamese peasantry against a global superpower, served as a potent symbol of defiance. It encouraged revolutionaries and nationalists in other parts of the world, from Africa to Latin America, to pursue their own struggles for self-determination, often adopting similar guerrilla tactics and drawing lessons from Vietnam's prolonged insurgency. In essence, the Vietnam War was more than just a historical event. It was a geopolitical earthquake whose tremors resonated for decades. It forced a fundamental recalculation of strategic priorities, redefined the limits of superpower influence, and left an indelible mark on the conduct of international relations. Its legacy continues to inform debates about intervention, the use of military force, and the wisdom of applying Western models to complex, unfamiliar cultures. Chapter 12. An enduring legacy, lessons learned, and the shadow of a generation. More than 5 decades have passed since the peak of American involvement in Vietnam, and nearly 5 decades since the fall of Saigon. Yet the Vietnam War remains a powerful and emotionally charged topic. A complex tapestry woven from historical interpretation, personal narratives, and its enduring influence on American culture, politics, and military thought. The shadow of Vietnam continues to define a generation and shape the national discourse, offering lessons both profound and painfully learned. Historical interpretation of the Vietnam War is far from monolithic. Historians and policymakers continue to debate its causes, conduct, and consequences. Was U.S. involvement a tragic miscalculation, a noble effort gone wrong, or an avoidable quagmire fueled by Cold War paranoia? Was the U.S. pursuit of peace with honor a cynical ploy, or a genuine attempt to extricate itself responsibly? Different interpretations emerge based on access to newly declassified documents, shifting political perspectives, and the evolving understanding of the war's broader context. This ongoing debate underscores the war's complexity and its refusal to be easily categorized or neatly concluded in the historical record. The war's profound impact on popular culture is perhaps its most visible and enduring legacy. From the gritty realism of films like Apocalypse Now and Platoon to the nuanced storytelling of Forrest Gump, Vietnam has been ceaselessly explored, reinterpreted, and immortalized on screen. Musicians like Creedence Clearwater Revival and Bob Dylan provided the soundtrack of dissent, while countless novels, plays, and memoirs have grappled with the themes of trauma, disillusionment, and the search for meaning in the war's aftermath. This constant cultural engagement demonstrates a collective need to process, remember, and understand a conflict that continues to resonate across generations, shaping perceptions of patriotism, government, media, and heroism. Beyond the cultural sphere, the Vietnam War left a deep and often bitter generational divide within American society. For the boomer generation, the war was a defining experience, shaping their worldview and often creating fault lines between those who served, those who protested, and those who simply watched from the sidelines. Debates about the draft, patriotism, and the use of military force continued to flare up, influencing subsequent political discourse and even parenting styles. The differing perspectives on the war became a cultural shorthand for broader ideological disagreements in American society. Several key lessons learned from Vietnam have permeated American strategic thinking and foreign policy. The limits of military power. Vietnam demonstrated that overwhelming conventional military superiority does not guarantee victory against a determined, politically motivated insurgency fought on its home turf. It underscored the importance of political objectives over purely military ones. The importance of public support. The erosion of domestic support proved fatal to the American war effort. Future interventions would necessitate a clear rationale, achievable objectives, and sustained public backing. The Powell Doctrine, advocating for clear political objectives, overwhelming force, and an exit strategy, emerged directly from the lessons of Vietnam. Distrust of government, and the credibility gap. The persistent misleading of the public by successive administrations about the war's progress and justifications led to a profound and lasting distrust of government, particularly regarding foreign policy matters. The media, too, faced scrutiny for its role in shaping public opinion. The human cost. The war highlighted the immense and often unseen human cost of conflict, not just in terms of casualties, but also the psychological, social, and physical burdens borne by veterans and their families. This led to greater awareness of PTSD and the need for comprehensive veteran care. The nuance of international relations. Vietnam underscored the complexities of applying a simple Cold War domino theory to diverse regional conflicts. It emphasized the importance of understanding local cultures, histories, and political dynamics. The Vietnam War's relevance persists even today. It continues to cast a long shadow on debates about American military interventions, from Iraq and Afghanistan to potential conflicts in the South China Sea. Discussions about forever wars, counterinsurgency, and the moral implications of foreign policy inevitably draw parallels, implicitly or explicitly, to the experience of Vietnam. The specter of a quagmire remains a powerful deterrent in American strategic calculations. In conclusion, the unfinished war aptly describes the Vietnam War. Its physical battles ended in 1975, but its legacy continues to be fought over in history books, reshaped in cultural narratives, and re-examined in the context of new global challenges. For many, it remains a painful wound, a cautionary tale, and a profound test of national character. For a new generation, it serves as a critical historical lens through which to view American power, its limitations, and the enduring consequences of involvement in global affairs. Understanding Vietnam is not merely an exercise in historical remembrance. It is an ongoing endeavor to comprehend the forces that shaped a nation and continue to define its place in a complex world.